Most companies collect more data in a single week than they can actually use in a year. You got to ask, what's that data for? And if you ask people that, sometimes the answer is going to be a blank stare. It's going to be a nervous laugh. It's going to be like, oh, what are we supposed to put in our dashboards? Right? Here's the truth. If you cannot articulate what your data is for, you can't design it, you can't trust it, and you definitely can't profit from it. So today we're going to talk about the very first, most foundational step in data readiness. It's defining 2 or 3 primary business questions that your data should answer. So this is the one step that's going to separate organizations that actually use their data from the ones that just store it. And if you get this right, every dollar you spend on analytics, data, AI, optimization, it's going to have a purpose. So this is my fancy sheet. Here's what we're going to talk about today, right? Who does graphics? So we're going to go core concept. We're going to talk about why it matters. We're going to talk about common failure modes. We're going to talk about how to do this right. And I'm going to talk about examples, give hypothetical examples. We're going to talk about the political and the human dimensions of this, because this is a political dimension. And then the technical integration and just making it a living practice, right? There you go. So core concept, right? Your data exists to serve decisions, not build dashboards, right? So a business question is not a metric. It's not a KPI. It's a clear, answerable query that leads directly to an action, right? So a bad question would be, how's our engagement? It's a bad question. A good question would be, which of our campaigns bring in high lifetime value customers? Do you see the difference? One is filling a report. The other is driving a decision. The 2 or 3 primary questions that you come up with, the 2 or 3 primary questions that you come up with, that becomes your compass, right? Every pipeline, every visualization, every meeting should ultimately help answer these questions. I remember one time worked with I think it was about a dozen people on a data team for a global brand, and they were just cranking out dashboards and reports, and nobody could agree on what they were trying to do, what they were trying to answer. It was just data puking, as Avinash would call it, right? And once we sat down and we actually worked with them, we delivered 3 clear business questions, everything really just snapped into place. They understood their priorities. They changed their KPIs. They were aligned with it. And honestly, even the morale of that team improved overnight, right? Because it almost like it gave them that mission and that purpose more than they ever had before. So, why this matters, when you don't define these questions up front, chaos creeps in, okay? Teams, they're going to optimize for what's easy to measure, not necessarily what matters. The click-through rate, impressions, vanity metrics. Engineers are going to build pipelines that look super impressive and they don't answer any questions, right? You're going to have analysts running in circles, producing dashboards and reports and charts that nobody uses. They're spitting these things out on a monthly or weekly, daily basis, and no one reads it, right? You have executives who you're presenting these things to that are at best nodding politely in meetings, if they're not just completely ignoring it and tapping away on their laptop. I'm listening. And then they go back to making gut decisions anyway, right? And the people closest to the data, your analysts, your engineers, your data scientists, they're going to burn out, right? Because they know that what they're doing is not moving the business. They feels futile to them, right? So without a defined purpose, you're building a data house on sand, right? Beautiful dashboards and zero foundation, okay? So, how many times have I seen companies who spend 6 figures, 7 figures in some cases, on a fancy platform, some fancy data platform, some fancy technology. And after 6 months or a year, right, they still can't answer the questions that they really need to answer. They're just burning through money and this technology. They're spending money on technology as opposed to questions, right? That's what happens when you start with technology instead of questions. So failure modes. Let's talk for a second about what not to do. Okay, so number 1 of what not to do is collecting data first and then asking, what can we do with it later? That's like buying groceries before deciding what you're cooking, right? You get home, let's do Korean. Like, well, we didn't buy any Korean ingredients. Okay, well, what do we have? Well, I feel like Korean. Well, we can't do Korean, right? So don't collect data first. You got to ask the questions first. That's the number 1 mistake. Number 2, you confuse KPIs with questions. You say, we have a question. Our question is like, what's our ROAS, right? That's not a question. That's a metric, right? a question would be, what spend level in this channel maximizes our profit? That's a question, right? Number 3, every department asking its own unaligned question. Marketing wants awareness. Finance wants margin. Product wants engagement. Everyone has different questions and nobody's answering the same thing, right? That's definitely another failure mode. Everyone's kind of fighting for what matters to them. A fourth one is leadership whiplash. I know plenty of people have been in a situation where they're doing one thing and a new leader comes in and they have a different favorite metric and it's all chaos. Everything you've done for potentially years out the window. Restart it all because you don't have primary questions, right? So this isn't all technical. This is not a technical exercise. It's mostly a human and political exercise. It's a business exercise, right? But if you don't facilitate that alignment early between the people and the business and the technical, you're going to get wars over your data later, right? I can think of another client who they had 2 teams and they were both right and they were both wrong. One was asking about what they were doing that was driving conversions, and one was asking what they were doing to drive revenue and profit, I should say. They were looking for profit versus conversions. And they used the same data and they came up to different conclusions, and they were literally just fighting over where they should invest their spend, because one side was just, this gives us more conversions. And the other side said, I don't care about conversions. I care about profit. We can sell less things if we make more money. And it was weird, but having that alignment fixes some of those problems. So that's a problem that can happen when you don't have those questions determined. This is organizationally, this is what our business questions are. So how do you do this right? So let's do this properly. So the first thing you got to do is you have to frame your questions, right? You start with business goals, not data availability. You start with business goals, not data availability. You want to ask, what decisions do we need to make next quarter that we can use data to inform it? How can we use data to inform our decisions? A good question changes behavior. If you have a question and answering it doesn't make you act differently, it's probably the wrong question. So there's the SMART questions. I like to say SMART Q, right? So a little SMART Q question, SMART question test. Is it specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, time-bound, and is it in question form? That's the Q part, SMART Q, right? So if you just say we want to improve ROAS, that's not anything. But at what spend level does our ROAS start to decline? That's a question. So that's the first part. It's just like framing these questions, starting from the business goals, not what data you have. And sometimes I've done this honestly where it's like literally have to tell people, don't worry about what we can collect and what we don't collect. I mean, even do stuff that we can't collect, right? Or that you think we can't collect. Because sometimes you can't, right? And sometimes they just don't think you can, but you actually can, right? Or you can come up with a good alternative, right? So just like put aside the data and tell me what is it that you want to know? What are the questions? What would affect your decision making if you knew it from the data? And then get those questions, right? So number 2 of that is to align your stakeholders, right? So again, you can have people wanting different things, and then that can cause internal battles, right? So if you have a data set or you have multiple data sets that interact in some way, you want to get, if you can, you want to get marketing, product, finance, ops, whatever the different groups are that use this data. You want to get them in one room, potentially. If you got to do virtually, that's fine. But you want to get them in a conversation together. And you want to say, what decision can't you make confidently today based on data? And preferably being in a room, go up to the whiteboard, write every answer on the board and try and cluster them by themes. Or, okay, that's this theme, that's that theme. And then maybe you can end up with a wall with 30 questions, 20 questions, 40 questions. I don't know. But people are going to have questions. And so write the questions down. And then here's a little trick, right? So this is the political trick. Well, number 1, you want to say, of those, if you see questions that people are agreeing to, right, kind of put dots by them, right? And you want to kind of look for like 2 or 3 questions that impact everyone. Are there questions that everyone gets impacted by or that the majority of people get impacted by? Note those, right? And then if you can, name each core question after the executive or the owner that cares about it most, right? So write down the CMO question, the CFO question. And it's a weird trick, but like when you align, it's a political trick. When you align that with the person who's cares about it most, people see themselves reflected, and suddenly you're going to get someone turn into an advocate. I've literally seen a CMO who was hesitant on data, probably because of how bad their data had been, but they wanted to know, I think it was lifetime value, like what campaigns are driving lifetime value. They were very lifetime value oriented, right? And once we identified, which campaigns truly drive lifetime value, and that was defined as, this is the CMO question, right? She got completely behind it. She helped champion the entire data initiative because she felt that she owned that question, and she felt that she was being heard, and she felt that like this was providing value to her, right? So third thing on here, you want to back map it technically, right? So you want to take the question and then you reverse engineer the data that it requires. Again, this is sort of that groceries versus, this is the question, this is the buying the groceries versus the what are we going to eat question, right? So now that you say, what do we want to eat? What are we going to do with this data? What is our question with this data? Then you figure out what data we need to collect, what we need to do with it, right? So you might be saying, what are our channels that drive profitable growth? And so what are the metrics for that? Our revenue, our cost of acquisition, our lifetime value, right? And then what are our data sources for this? Okay, well, we got GA4, and we've got stuff from our CRM, and we got some hard accounting numbers from finance, and I have this information from this ad channel, right? Whatever that is, right? You define who the owner of it is. It's the data lead, the project lead for it. And then what is the cadence that you want to try and answer this question? Maybe it's weekly, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's daily, right? Whatever that is, you want to say, you frame that now. So we say we have our business question, we have our metrics, we have our data sources, we have our owner, we have our cadence, and suddenly your tracking plan, your ETL jobs, your dashboards, everything has a purpose, right? And then, I've literally seen teams cut 80%, more than 80%. Of their tracking once they defined these questions, because they realized that more than half of what they were collecting didn't answer anything, had no point, didn't mean anything to their business, anything that they cared about, right? It was just noise, and they were able to cut it. And that saved them time on that as well, on the data collection, the data engineering part of it. So let's get to some hypothetical examples, right? So let's make it more concrete, right? So let's say you're an e-commerce business. One thing I've seen from e-com before that I would say is a bad question is, it's like, which products get most clicks? Which products get the most clicks, right? You have a big product page, you got 100 products on it. What's getting the most clicks? Who cares, right? That is not the question. What's a good question? Which promotions are increasing the average order value among our repeat customers? That's a good question. You want to increase, what do you want? Oh, we want to increase our average order value. We want to increase our, we really, for our repeat customers, like we want them to buy more. We want to get a bigger order value. Okay, that's a good question, right? That's something that we can build towards. But what gets the most clicks? This is what gets the most clicks. What if we change the order? Okay, the ones at the top are going to get the most clicks. How does that change your decision? It doesn't, right? So e-com, that's one example, right? There's a ton, right? But that's one example. SaaS business, how many users are logged in? I've seen that before. We want to know how many users are logged into our system. Okay, right? But how is that changing your behavior really? But, maybe a good question for a SaaS company could be something like, what early behaviors are predicting conversion from a free trial to a paid user within 30 days? Right? That's a good question. What can we do to encourage more people to go from free to paid, right? Those are questions that, again, you can make decisions based on. Retail. Let's say you're in a retail world, right? Like, how many people visited our stores? It's a vanity metric, right? But a good question could be like, how does staffing level affect the daily sales per square foot? That would be a question, right? Or for a nonprofit, how many donors opened our newsletter? Again, you want to have a better question. A good question for a nonprofit could be like, which outreach channels led to more recurring donations over 12 months, right? They want more recurring donations. That's a more valuable question. The pattern here, again, it's good questions connect to decisions and outcomes, not activity, right? You want, how can I make a decision based on this question? So that's kind of where the human side comes in, the political and human dimensions, right? Alignment here, it's 80% psychology, right? 20% technical, 20% SQL, 80% psychology, right? Different teams are going to have different definitions of success, and your job, whether you're a data leader, consultant, an analyst, your job is to be the translator. When you do this, it makes people feel heard, and you want people to be heard first. You want to validate them first. First thing you do, it's good advice for everything. Someone feels heard. You've heard them, right? And then things are falling on my desk. You hear them, right? Like, so you want to run a question harvest, right? Everyone write their top 3 unanswered questions, right? Give me your top unanswered questions. And then you group them by theme. And then which of these questions, if we answered, would immediately change your behavior, right? Which of these questions, if you knew the answers to, would we immediately make decisions based on? Those are your priorities, right? So, I mean, I've had multiple marketing execs be defensive, right? They're coming in defensive, I think I mentioned before. And, some people think data is there to police them, to prevent them from doing their job, right? They're skeptical of data. They want to follow their gut. They have 30 years experience, right? I know what to do, right? But if they're gonna have questions, right? They want to have goals. And so if you say, like, don't reject, find out their questions, don't reject their questions, validate their questions, right? Reframe it if you need to, instead of rejecting it. And when you do that, and when these people that were before skeptics didn't open the dashboards or reports to save their life, they become your strongest partners because you're there providing them value. The process builds trust as much as it builds clarity, right? If you don't have trust from the people who are going to use this data to make decisions, the executives, the people making decisions, if they do not trust the data, your ability to answer their questions, if you're not giving them value, it's a huge problem, right? There's no clarity without that trust. So technical integration, let's bring it back to the systems, right? So let's say you've had those conversations and you have those 2 or 3 questions, and that, that defines your schema, right? That decides, what are you tagging? What are you collecting? What are you storing? What are you modeling? And so if your questions, which campaigns drive profit, and you don't have gross margin data in your warehouse, you can't answer it, right? So you can't make the Korean food without the kimchi, right? So, you got to map every question, every these business questions, map it to, like, what's required, what fields, what events, what are the sources, how often do you need to update it, how you're doing quality checks on this data, what's the reporting surface for it. And that's how data engineering and business strategy can finally speak that same language. And so once you're past that, it's not a one and done checklist. You need to make it a living practice. You need to revisit your questions quarterly. Business goals can change. Your compass needs recalibration. So tie every analytics sprint to one of your top 3 questions. You want to include those questions right in your data charter, and even your new hire onboarding, right? Imagine if you started at a company and you're in the data practice or you're in some other practice, and it's like, here's our data charter, here's the questions that we want to answer in this business. I don't think most people do that, but can you imagine going into a new job, right? And onboarding, and it's like, these are the questions that matter to our business. These are our goals. This is how we're going to make an impact. To me, that's amazing, right? And again, getting back to, like, burnout, if you feel like, as a data person, if you feel you are impacting the business and you know how, and you know the goals, and how do I do this better, right? You are going to feel that you are providing value to the company, as opposed to just scraping data and putting it in a bucket that no one ever looks at. That's demoralizing. So, ask your team, can we confidently answer these 3 questions today, right? So get your questions, go to your team. Can we answer these questions confidently? If the answer is yes, more often, especially like this quarter over the last, you're improving. You can measure that if you want, but, like, your goal should be, can we do this more confidently than we did 3 months ago? Can we answer these questions better now than in the past? That's what you should be building towards from a technical side. And so, I mean, like, I've seen companies who, back in we're all in the same office days, print their top 3 questions and they put it up on the wall as a poster, right? This is what we're trying to answer in the data team, right? Every new project, everything you were doing tied back to the questions. You would see it, you would hear it in meetings. How does this tie back to our questions? And, everyone knew. When you do this, everyone knows what data is for. Everyone knows, interns, executives, every new hire, everyone knows what you're doing and why you're using this data, how you're using this data, what you're trying to do with this data. It makes such a huge difference. So I'm going to bring it home. If you can't name your top 3 business questions, your data is not ready. It's just noise. If you can't answer your questions, right? So start there. Start with your questions. Once your questions are clear, every pipeline, every report, every insight is suddenly going to have a reason to exist. So what are your top 3 questions? You can drop them in the comments. You can bring them to your next team meeting. You might be surprised how much alignment and how much opportunity comes out of this simple exercise. And thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, as they say, and good luck.